The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Helen Brice, BAPAM Psychotherapist, and I'm joined here today by Maria Chiari Valsecchi, ISM Legal Advisor. Before we begin, a few points. The content of this presentation is for information purposes only. It's not intended to be a substitute for legal or other professional advice and should not be relied upon as such. You can contact us about your specific situation, and IS members can contact the ISM legal team. You can't see me, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation displayed on your screen. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. If you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound, quality issues, please let us know in the question box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issue. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. So let me start by explaining that my experience in talking to you today comes from working in 5 different therapy settings: a London-based conservatoire for music and dance, the NHS, the prison service and young offenders institution, private hospital setting, and private practice. And prior to becoming a psychotherapist, I worked as a composer's manager and classical music producer on recordings and live concerts. So let's ask the first question. What is resilience? Now, if you look this up online, these are generally the definitions that come up. This is the physics side of it. The first example, resilience is the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation caused especially by compressive stress. So this, whilst it's alluding to something like an elastic band, something or piece of rubber that stretches and is deformed and then can come back, that shows resilience. It comes back to its original state. It's a very apt description for what happens with us humans as well. And the second definition makes this stronger for humans. It's an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And I'll come on to this later, but sometimes change can even mean positive change. And some people will find that they need resilience for that too, but more of that further on. So let's look at what resilience is. Resilience is sometimes described as bouncing back after disappointment, or trying again, having failed previously, coming back for more when you've been rejected. Think how many auditions that one has to keep preparing for, and how many rejections there might be that you still have to come back for more. Continuing even when you've been disempowered. And resilience is about being judged and getting over it. It means trying to be adaptable to your environment. And now, let's look at what resilience is not. It's not never falling apart. It's not necessarily being fiercely independent at any cost. It's not never experiencing embarrassment or shame or guilt or sadness or depression or anxiety or any of those sometimes referred to as self-conscious emotions. It's not about being unaffected by misfortune or being inflexible or rigid or unyielding or firm or hard or not crumbly or flaky. It's not any of those things that we might associate sometimes with resilience. And this is the next thing that I wanted to highlight, is that sometimes and you may question this yourself, are you mistaking resilience when you see it in other people, or when you're attempting to be resilient yourself? Are you mistaking being emotionally over-controlled as being resilient? So what do I mean by being emotionally over-controlled? This might be somebody who is perfectionistic. Now, most musicians have that quality, so it's not all about that, but it's there. Perfectionistic, stoic, enduring, not easily impressed might be a characteristic. Someone who's always dutiful. Someone who always thinks before acting, does not have the capability of being spontaneous. You might be reserved in character and generally very organized and generally deliberate. So decisions will be made by having thought them through. Now, some of these characteristics are needed in the work as a musician: perfectionism, stoicism to keep going. But let's have a look at where it becomes over-controlled. It's where these things become problematic, and where they are first and foremost your way of being in the world. So on the other hand, this can appear as a type of resilience. And in fact, it's possible that they are being mistaken for a kind of snowplow approach of determination. So indeed, these personality traits or ways of coping in the world, this stoicism, being enduring, being organized, and this way of relating and interacting to another person appears to be resilient. Resilient to being defeated by hard work, resilient to taking no for an answer, and resilient to doing things that go against your principles and your idea of what is right, or the right way to do things. Now, the trouble is, people with emotional over-control have also the type of personality that won't let you see them sweat. They are apparently resilient to criticism, in that they might quickly disagree with feedback from what is disconfirming. They might be being defensive, or they'll ignore the information and instead cite criticism or verbal attacks on you. They seem to have a Teflon cloak. They always seem to have an answer, and oftentimes this has become their weapon to combat their own sensitivity and feelings of threat. In other words, they're probably overcompensating. So it doesn't mean that you have to be inflexible and stoic to the end that you can't hear feedback that might be useful for you. Let's have a look now at what being unresilient looks like. So psychological resilience can be associated with sensitivity. Some people are born sensitive. So their resilience and their ability to bounce back from adverse situations, from misfortune, from setbacks, is already impaired. So some words that might be associated with being unresilient are brittle, crumbly, veering away from conflict. They're people-pleasing. They're not open with opinions, and usually always appeasing. The difference between being a little bit unresilient and being emotionally over-controlled is that an emotionally over-controlled person will avoid conflict by any means. So they will not hear back any criticism. There might be some verbal abuse or attacking, but they will not enter into a discussion that involves conflict. They'll give it out. Someone who is unresilient may veer away from the conflict and certainly wouldn't give verbal abuse. But now let's think about what psychological resilience might look like. As I've mentioned before, musicians, performers, actors, writers, a lot of people who come into my own private practice, those who create anything that the public is going to witness or see or read or hear, are resilient in their work all the time, writing another novel despite bad reviews of the last one, continuing playing when you fluffed or split a note that's pierced across the orchestra, writing another song when your last one's been rejected by the publisher, getting back on stage when your performance or your work or your recording has been decimated by the press, turning up to rehearsal despite the repeated eye rolls or cold shoulder from another member. You have resilience already. Resilience is being able to show a bit of vulnerability, because vulnerability connects us to people and says, you and I are the same. We're part of the same tribe. So, for example, admitting that I really let my nerves get the better of me at that audition to another member, and then going back for more, or an example of talking to someone else who has a different opinion of you. I have a completely different outlook to such and such than you, and I'm curious to hear more. Can we go for coffee? Those are examples of being able to stand a bit of conflict, to show a little bit of vulnerability and a bit of resilience to difference. So let's think about what characters would appear to be resilient. So one person that came to my mind is the character from Clueless, Alicia Silverstone. Now there's somebody with resilience. I suppose she had something in mind. She wanted to win her guy back. She wanted to win her man back. But throughout the storyline, despite being shamed or embarrassed in public, at parties, in front of colleagues and peers, she kind of went away and did her homework quietly and bounced back. And that shows some kind of resilience. I don't know if any of you have heard of, you might have heard because there was a film recently about Eddie the Eagle, who was Britain's only downhill skier, who was pretty hopeless in terms of always coming last, because of course we don't have snow here enough to practice. And he showed resilience by coming back over and over and over again and training and trying and not being defeated. Somebody else who came to mind who shows resilience is the footballer Rio Ferdinand, who lost his wife to cancer and has been able to speak about it and has been able to be very upfront with his children and to grieve with his children and be strong in front of them as well, and be strong in the public face. That shows resilience too. I'm just looking at my slides and lifting my face out of my notes. I'm just thinking there's a bullet point here about when people have become thin-skinned due to a loss of confidence. This is now coming on to how resilience comes up into my own work as a psychotherapist, working with musicians and performers and those in the creative field. It's usually when resilience has decreased, when people have become thin-skinned, as it says there. Why do people get thin-skinned? It's usually because there's been a loss of confidence. And what contributes to a loss of confidence? Oftentimes it's a toxic workplace environment, and there'll be more of that later. But also it could be life events such as relationship breakups, acrimonious splits, death, a diagnosis of an illness, or a sudden change of life circumstances, as I mentioned before, including positive change, such as a birth or marriage. There can sometimes be a bit of an existential crisis going on, because who are you becoming? Who are you in this new union? Who are you now that the family have grown? And this can really have a knock of our confidence and sometimes our self-worth I remember reading about many years ago when Dame Maggie Smith suddenly developed stage fright. And it was after she had been diagnosed and recovered from breast cancer. She suddenly, for the first time in later years, she experienced stage fright. And one would imagine that that was due to a major life event change. So now let's think about why is resilience important? Well, it's important for maintaining or increasing self-worth, for nurturing confidence, for enabling effective communication amidst conflict and disagreement. And the things that threaten resilience and mental health in the workplace are these things listed on this as bullet points here: harassment, verbal attacks, continuous criticism, denigration, consistent digs that can be plausibly denied as teasing, being given the cold shoulder, being sent to commentary. There's something that may come up when Chiara speaks. In my experience, this plausible deniability that anybody's doing any harm, but they're just teasing, is a really hard nut to crack, because the person on the receiving end of it feels it very deeply, but it's very hard to explain and to pinpoint to others. But we'll be able to discuss that a bit later. How do you improve your psychological resilience? Well, the capacity in the first instance is to say to yourself, what is it that I might be bringing to this? What is my role in this? For example, if you tend to be someone who's self-deprecating, consistently verbalizing self-doubt or diffidence, then you have a propensity to become a target for those in the workplace that need to keep marking their territory or asserting their authority, asserting their authority or their opinion. And this might be quite a hard concept to take on board, but oftentimes, especially when people come to therapy, if they've come that far, it's something that I would say very early on in the work. And it's something that is a very useful self-inquiry question. What is my role in this? Because there could be something in your character style that's inadvertently attracting this behavior from someone else. So it's just always useful to bear that in mind. Now, what do you do if that is happening? What do you do to improve psychological resilience? And you wonder how this might be stopped and how it's happening to you. First thing is to ask a trusted friend whether there's something you might be giving off inadvertently to attract this behavior from another. So this is somebody private, someone away from the organization probably, or it's very useful if you tend to be working on your own. Go to a friend and ask them, do some self-inquiry around it. But now there may be some questions that you want to raise about that, or I can talk about that in a bit more detail. But let's look at the kind of techniques that one would need to consider to improve psychological resilience. There's a practical one that I always advise clients. Early on, this is before anything's reported, apart from logging or reporting the behavior, imagine donning a golden cloak or a Teflon coating as a layer of resilience before being in the presence of the person whom you are intimidated by or feel overpowered. This is quite a useful technique. So it's just to help and it's something that can be done very early on. It's most effective early on. If you notice that someone's intimidating, this is quite a good visualization exercise. But it's important to, whatever you do or don't do, one thing is to log the behaviour privately for yourself. Keep your own little gripes file, I call it, that you may or may not share straight away with a line manager or someone in immediate authority of you, above you. The other thing is that coaching is very useful. That visualization exercise comes amongst one of the techniques in coaching. If someone was coming to me and wanted to be more resilient, I would teach them to hone their awareness of emotions, physical sensations, thoughts, memories, and images. Something that I have learned through behavior therapy, which is called the awareness continuum. And the awareness continuum is a practical mindfulness exercise. Mindfulness is a word that's bandied about a lot these days. Mindfulness is not about relaxation or feeling better. Mindfulness is just awareness, and the awareness continuum is something that I would teach. And I could revisit this at the end if anyone has specific questions as to what that sounds like. I could demonstrate it afterwards if you like. Another technique to help lessen the threat of being in the presence of somebody is to switch on your safety system. Everybody, in our brain, we have something called the ventral vagal complex. When we're scared, the safety system is switched off. The way that it's switched off is that we become expressionless. Our face becomes flat. Even our vocal tone becomes flat. We become smaller. We make fewer movements. And the trouble is that this keeps sending a message to our brain that there's a threat here, there's a threat, there's a threat. The good news is you can switch your safety system on, and it happens within milliseconds. And there's a unique, there are 4 steps to do this, and I can demonstrate this to you now. You need to get that face moving so that you're not continually sending a message and keeping your ventral vagal complex switched off. The message that you want is there's no threat, and to do that is to move. So waggle your eyebrows, wag them at the start of each sentence. Raise your eyebrows. This can be done very subtly, and it's something I encourage people to practice in front of the mirror first, because it will feel like a big movement if you're used to having a very flat face when you're scared with somebody. So you wag your eyebrows, you lean back. If you're sitting down, you lean back and you breathe diaphragmatically, and you have a closed mouth smile. A smile is the only way to move the lower part of your face. So it's not about smiling and grinning and bearing it. It's about just moving your face and getting those smile lines around your eyes and the corners of your mouth up. And this switches your safety system on. And this invokes a sense of control, that you can manage an intimidating situation. There's also, what I give to my clients is a unique mindfulness meditation which invokes calm and peacefulness. It's not available on Headspace or other apps. It's something that is scripted by Professor Tom Lynch, who's done a lot of research with people who have experience with being over-controlled with their emotions, so that they don't give anything away. And when we're nervous and intimidated, we tend to want to make ourselves smaller. And the mindfulness meditation encourages a sense of peace that can last from anywhere from 20 minutes to 4 hours. And the great thing about this particular exercise is that it makes any other techniques that you already know, or some of the things I've already mentioned, work more effectively. Now, once panic attacks set in, or taking time off work, it's a different kind of coaching that's required, and perhaps some deeper psychological work is required. These techniques are still useful, but it's always better to try to be aware that you're feeling harassed or feeling intimidated very early on. And the one thing that I would say is maybe there's a question about this later. The difference is to be aware of the difference between being determined and being resilient. Determination is much more like a snow plow. Being resilient is rather more like a motorbike navigating the snow. Snow plow goes on regardless, and everything in its way gets pushed aside. Now that's somebody who might appear resilient, but is actually quite bullying, and come what may, will have their own way. When you're resilient, like the motorbike, you have to stop, you have to get off, you have to get a different route. You might have to abandon your bike and get the bus or go back home. And there may be situations where actually the person bullying or the situation is just too powerful, and you need some resilience by saying, okay, I need to back out of this. Actually, I need to leave. We can have some questions about that for discussion a bit later if you like. But essentially, that's my presentation on resilience.
First of all, thank you for this opportunity to discuss bullying, as this is an issue that here at the ISM we are often consulted upon by our members. Let's start with some definitions. Bullying and harassment are terms which are generally employed interchangeably to define an unwanted conduct carried out by one or more persons against another or others. The ACAS defines workplace bullying as offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behavior, and abuse or misuse of power through means that undermine, humiliate, denigrate, or injure the person being bullied. We can make a few examples of bullying and harassing behavior, which could include spreading malicious rumors or insulting someone, exclusion, victimization, silent treatment, unfair treatment, deliberately undermining a competent worker by constant criticism, humiliating an employee in front of other members of the staff, regularly shouting and swearing at someone, physical or psychological intimidation, putting someone under pressure to solve any problems and never be satisfied by anything he does, blunt language and inappropriate banter. In employment law, harassments assume a further more precise meaning. Harassment is regulated by the Equality Act 2010. The general definition of harassment is that it occurs if a person harasses another one, if this person engages in unwanted conduct related to a relevant protected characteristic, and the conduct for the purpose or effect of violating the other person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the other person. The Equality Act defines the protected characteristics as those relating to age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, pregnancy and maternity, sex and sexual orientation. Under the Equality Act, therefore, harassment is also a statutory form of discrimination occurring when the unwanted conduct is relating to a protected characteristic. It is worth noting that under the provision of the Protection from Harassment Act 1997, harassment also amounts to a tort and a criminal offense. The type of protection you are entitled to will mostly depend on whether you work under a proper contract of employment, or you are self-employed, or you could be classed at least as a worker. As an employee, you will benefit from the entire range of protection afforded by statutes, including the Employment Rights Act 1996, the Equality Act 2010, and the principle of common law. So, for example, all employers have a duty to take reasonable care for the safety of their employees, to provide them with a safe place of work, safe tool and equipment, and a safe system of working. In the employment context, if an employer has subjected his employees to an excessive workload, or if their employees have become ill as a result of workplace bullying, an employer could be held liable for relevant damages as a result of a breach of their duty of care. Employment contracts also include an implied term of mutual trust and confidence. Where an employee is suffering from stress, they may argue that this has been caused by their employer, require them to deal with unrealistic and excessive workloads, creating or failing to deal with hostile working environment, or as a result of being responsible for the action of third parties, which could amount to a fundamental breach of the implied terms of trust and confidence. So, what an employee could do. Although this is not a mandatory requirement, an employer would be expected to have adopted a grievance procedure, which would be set out in the staff handbook. The staff handbook is generally given to the employees at the outset of his or her employment. If you do not have a copy, you could ask the HR department of your employer, or you can make contact with the ISM, who will make contact on your behalf with your employer. If you have been subjected to bullying and or harassment, the first step should be that of approaching your line manager and discussing the matter informally with him or her. If this is not possible, or the matter is not resolved that way, then you could resort to a formal grievance procedure. The legal department of the ISM is at your complete disposal for any consultation on this matter and will be assisting you in the drafting of the grievance and throughout the relevant procedure if you need it. The grievance will aim primarily to obtain that the conduct of bullying and harassment will cease and the harasser discipline if not dismissed. However, it may be the case that the matter remains unsolved or that as a result of the bullying you suffered from work-related stress and are unable to come back to work, or you intend to seek a compensation. In this case, you could consider bringing a claim against your employer. In particular, if your mental symptoms if you suffer from mental symptoms and such mental symptoms amount to personal injuries, you can bring a claim for personal injuries as a result of a breach of the employer common law of duty of care. In this case, general principle of law of negligence will apply. You can bring an action for breach of contract. An employee suffering from stress may argue that this is the result of their employer breach of express or implied terms of the employment contract, and that in addition to a common law claim for breach of the contract itself, they also have a statutory claim for constructive unfair dismissal. You can bring a claim for unfair dismissal in case, for example, you have been assigned off sick with stress and you are then dismissed. Or you can bring a claim for disability discrimination. Anxiety, stress and depression and relating condition having a substantial and long-term adverse effect on an employee's day-to-day activities may, under certain circumstances, amount to a disability, giving rise to protection under the Equality Act 2010. Finally, you can also bring an action under the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. An employee suffering from work-related stress may consider whether they can bring a claim under this statute, which prohibits anyone from pursuing a course of conduct which would amount to harassment and which that person knows or ought to know that amount to harassment. If you work on a purely self-employment basis, you will not benefit from the same protection as an employee. In particular, you will not generally be entitled to make use of grievance procedure because you're not actually part of the staff. Nor you will be protected against unfair dismissal because the Employment Rights Act 1997 will not apply to you. The application of the Equality Act 2010 will actually depend on the analysis of the specific characteristics of your engagement. As long as your contract obliges you to perform your work personally, in other words, you are not permitted to subcontract any part of the work or to employ your own staff to do that, then the Equality Act provision will actually apply to you and you can resort to the protection provided therein. Unlike an employee, and a self-employed person does not have a manager or human resources department to discuss and complain about instances of discrimination. If you are an ISM member who is a self-employed person and you believe that discrimination is damaging your opportunity for work, we would encourage you to make contact with us so that we can assist you. Similarly, a self-employed person working on a client premises has the right to expect that the client has carried out a health and safety risk assessment. This assessment applies as much to self-employed workers as to the client's employees. Finally, we can mention that in 2018, the ISM and the Musician Union have launched a joint code of practice to help eradicate bullying, harassment, and discrimination in the music sector. The code of practice is a set of principles that aims to eradicate bullying, harassment, discrimination, and other forms of inappropriate behavior within the music sector. These principles also aim to aid employers in meeting their legal requirements, as well as setting out a shared vision for promoting and maintaining a positive working culture. You can check whether the organization you are engaged by has signed up to the code, as this may give you further protection and another form of leverage. Over 50 organizations have already signed up, including orchestras, festivals, venues, and music education apps. You can download the code from the ISM website.
Perfect. Thank you very much for Chiara and Helen for this insightful presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them through. If, however, you don't have a chance to send them through now and you can come up with them later, don't hesitate to send them through to the ISM email address and we will pass them on to Helen or Chiara. And of course, ISM members, if there are any legal inquiries that you're concerned about, just feel free to contact the ISM legal team and they are here for your help. Are there any questions?
There's an interesting question about if you are, I mentioned in my presentation, if you have the propensity to be self-deprecating and sort of reserved and fairly quiet, what practically can you do to be more resilient in that moment? This would be in the early stages if you recognise that somebody's a little bit more intimidating than you. And I suppose I thought it'd be it's useful to give some practical advice around that, which is essentially you need to be able to have the courage to sort of physically take up more space. So when you are standing, come nearer and stand upright, bring your shoulders back, use slightly bigger gestures than you're used to. So It's hard. No, I know I can't be seen, but instead of sitting with our hands on our lap and head down, hold your head up, shoulders back, and maybe use a gesture to accentuate a word. I'm sort of waving my hand, shaking my head, looking around now as I'm thinking about what to say. Use some physical movement to occupy the space a bit more. Somebody that I spoke to in my private practice gave a great example that when they feel intimidated on the tube, they deliberately reach up to both sides of the tube handles in the middle of the gangway and occupy more space, and she feels more empowered. And it's just taking more space. It's not being confrontational, and that can be very useful to help with intimidation. So we've got a question here.
I've got a question from Vicky, who asks, do you recommend any further resources about developing resilience?
Any further resources? I guess we're looking more now at individual tools and skills. There was one that I just mentioned that I hadn't brought up before. It's something that I can put something together to reply to this in more detail. So a detail of the loving kindness meditation, which invokes peace and calm, and the big 3+1 eyebrow wag, leaning back, diaphragmatic breathing, closed mouth smile. I can send some information about that was developed by Professor Tom Lynch to manage social anxiety, actually, and to better manage communication in conflict. I don't know if you have anything, Chiara, but it's definitely worth writing things down right at the start so that you are aware of it and you're owning it and naming it, because then if you're looking at it, if you're looking it in the face, you've got more of an idea of, okay, what do I need to do about this? Do I need to go and ask someone for help? Can I get some help from a professional? Do I need to speak to my line manager now? So making a note of this and helps accepting it first can help you then make changes to manage it.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, if there are any further questions after this streaming, feel free to send them to the ISM email address, and we'll pass them on to the relevant people. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to both of you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.